his breath forming faint clouds in the icy air. His spot on the sidewalk wasn't much, a patch of concrete near a busy intersection, but it was where he spent his days, hoping for kindness from passing strangers. A cardboard sign rested against his knees, its faded letters reading, "Hungry. Need help." James had been there for hours, his stomach growling louder than the honking cars around him. People passed by in their designer coats and polished shoes, their eyes fixed ahead, carefully avoiding his. The familiar pang of rejection stabbed at his heart. Today felt like every other day, until he saw her. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its glossy surface reflecting the city lights. James sat up straighter, squinting as the car door opened. Out stepped a woman draped in elegance, a pristine white coat, sparkling heels, and an unmistakable air of sophistication. She stood out like a beacon amidst the gray cityscape. It took James a moment to realize who she was. Melania Trump. His heart pounded. He wasn't one to approach celebrities, but desperation overruled hesitation. Gathering the little courage he had left, he called out, his voice trembling, "Ma'am, can you spare $1?" For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The city's noise faded as Melania turned her head toward him. Her piercing gaze met his, and James felt exposed, as though she could see through his ragged clothes and unshaven face, straight into the broken man he had become. The world seemed to hold its breath as she paused mid-step. Her security detail shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between James and her. The crowd, always hungry for spectacle, began to take notice. James braced himself for rejection, a dismissive wave, or perhaps no response at all. But what came next was something he couldn't have anticipated. Melania took a step closer, her heels clicking against the pavement. Her expression softened, not pity, but something deeper, almost curious. She stopped just a few feet away, her voice calm yet firm. "Why just $1?" she asked, her question hanging in the air like a challenge. James blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. The crowd murmured, phones now aimed at the unfolding scene. And in that moment, for the first time in years, James felt truly seen. As Melania's words hung in the air, "Why just $1?" James felt a wave of vulnerability wash over him. Her question was simple, yet it pierced through the layers of his pain. How did he end up here, asking strangers for spare change on a freezing sidewalk? The answer wasn't easy, and it carried the weight of years of heartbreak. James wasn't always homeless. There was a time when his life was defined by purpose, not despair. He had been a construction worker, a skilled one at that. His hands once built skyscrapers that now loomed over the very street where he sat, broken and invisible. He took pride in his work, in the calluses that lined his palms, proof of his dedication to his craft. He used to come home every evening to a small, cozy apartment, where the smell of his wife's cooking greeted him. Those were the days of warmth and laughter, days that felt like a lifetime ago. But life has a cruel way of turning even the strongest foundations to rubble. It began with an accident, a beam falling from a height, crushing his leg. The doctor said he was lucky to survive, but James didn't feel lucky. The injury cost him his job, and the medical bills drained his savings. Soon after, his wife left, unable to cope with the mounting stress. The downward spiral was swift and merciless. Within a year, James lost his apartment. He went from paying rent to sleeping in shelters, and finally, to the streets. Pride kept him from reaching out for help, and shame silenced him when old friends walked by without recognizing him. Now, sitting in the biting cold, James was a shadow of his former self. His beard was unkempt, his eyes hollow. Every day felt like a battle, against hunger, against judgment, against the gnawing loneliness that consumed him. As Melania stood before him, her gaze steady and unflinching, James felt the urge to tell her his story. Not because he wanted her pity, but because, for the first time in years, someone was asking him a question that mattered. And yet, he hesitated. How could he explain a lifetime of loss in just a few words? Still, her presence stirred something within him, a faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this encounter would be different. The words hung between them, thick with a weight neither James nor Melania could easily ignore. "Why just $1?" Melania repeated, her tone not harsh but filled with an almost tender curiosity. It was as if she was trying to peel back the layers of his pain with a single, seemingly simple question. James, caught off guard by her willingness to engage, could barely find his voice. He blinked, feeling exposed in a way that was both unfamiliar and oddly comforting. The cold wind sliced through the streets, but for a moment, it felt like time had frozen. The world around them continued, the honking of cars and the murmur of the crowd, but all James could focus on was Melania's unwavering gaze. She wasn't looking down on him, as most did. Instead, she was looking at him, as if he mattered. His heart skipped a beat, not from excitement but from a quiet disbelief. In all the years he had lived on the streets, no one had ever looked at him like that. Her security guards, standing a few steps behind, shifted uncomfortably. Some of the bystanders snapped photos, likely thinking this would be another viral moment to share with the world. But Melania's expression remained steady, calm, unaffected by the eyes that were now on her. She was present in that moment with James. I don't need much, just something to eat, James stammered, his voice breaking the silence between them. He wasn't used to talking to people like this, especially not someone so far removed from his world. Yet, her question had somehow opened the door to something more than just a handout. It felt like an invitation to share his reality, a reality he had buried deep inside. Melania's lips parted, her expression softening, but it wasn't pity in her eyes. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. I see, she said simply, as though she understood more than he had expected. Her tone wasn't rushed, nor was it dismissive. There was no judgment, just a genuine search for understanding. James, still reeling from the tenderness in her voice, could hardly believe what was happening. He had spent years in the cold, on the margins of society, invisible to everyone. And now here she was, not just asking him a question, but seeing him. He felt his defenses crumble. This wasn't a fleeting moment of charity, it was something else. But as she took a step closer, James wondered, what would come next? Was this just a fleeting encounter, or would it be the turning point he had longed for in the deepest part of his soul? As Melania stepped closer, James felt a strange warmth spread through him, something he hadn't felt in years. The chill of the evening air still wrapped around him, but her presence, calm and composed, felt like a brief escape from his cold reality. Her gaze softened further, her eyes no longer just curious but filled with something else. Empathy, maybe? He wasn't sure. But there was no mistaking that her attention was entirely on him, like he mattered. The crowd around them grew quieter, sensing the shift in energy. Some continued to snap pictures, while others lingered, unsure of how to respond to this rare moment of humanity unfolding in the heart of the city. The eyes of the world were on them, but neither James nor Melania seemed to notice. After a beat of silence, she finally spoke, her voice steady yet laced with something James hadn't expected. You're more than just $1. And I think you deserve more than just a handout. The words hit James like a wave, sweeping over him with a force he wasn't prepared for. He had spent so much of his life trying to disappear, to fade into the background. But here she was, offering him something far more valuable than the spare change he had been begging for. She wasn't just offering charity, she was offering dignity. He blinked, trying to process what she said. His throat tightened, emotions rushing in faster than he could catch his breath. More than just $1? His mind reeled. What did she mean by that? Did she intend to help him in some way beyond this fleeting encounter? It seemed too good to be true. He had grown used to people dismissing him. Quick glances, pitying stares, or worse, indifference. The thought of someone really seeing him, of someone caring enough to want to do more than offer change, was a foreign concept. Melania took another step toward him, and this time, her expression wasn't just kind, it was resolute. Let me help you get back on your feet, she said, her voice firm and assured, leaving no room for doubt. James' heart raced as her words sank in. He wasn't sure how to respond. He had always believed that his situation was too far gone, that he was too broken to be fixed. But her offer, so direct, so genuine, made him question everything he had ever thought about his own worth. For a moment, James couldn't speak. He just stared at her, unsure if this was some kind of dream or a cruel joke. But as the seconds passed, he realized this wasn't a joke. This was real. And in that moment, as she stood before him, he felt something shift deep inside him. Could it be? Could this be the beginning of the change he had longed for? Or was it just another fleeting moment of kindness in a world that would quickly forget him? James stood frozen, his heart pounding so loudly he thought Melania might hear it. The weight of her Words hung in the air, impossibly heavy, yet filled with a kind of warmth he hadn't felt in so long. "Let me help you get back on your feet." The simplicity of the offer stunned him, sending a shiver through his spine. It was like she had unlocked a door he had closed off long ago, one he had forgotten how to open. His mind raced, torn between skepticism and the raw, desperate hope that bloomed within him. He had been to countless shelters, had spoken to countless strangers, each time expecting nothing but a polite refusal or a hurried dismissal. But here, in front of him, was someone who was genuinely offering him a chance. A chance. For a moment, it felt too unreal. He could barely remember the last time someone had seen him, really seen him, not as a beggar, not as someone to avoid, but as a human being deserving of help. For a long time, James had allowed the streets to define him. The cold, the hunger, the isolation, all of it had carved deep scars into him. He had convinced himself that he was beyond repair, that no one cared. His pride had shattered along with his self-worth, piece by piece, until all that was left was an empty shell. Now, Melania's words reached into the depths of his soul, stirring feelings he had buried long ago. Was he ready to accept help? The thought scared him. He had spent years trying to maintain some semblance of control over his life, even if it meant pretending to be okay. To accept help, to admit that he needed it, didn't that make him weak? No, he reminded himself. It didn't. It simply made him human. Melania's eyes never wavered, steady and kind, waiting for his response. She wasn't offering a handout, she was offering a lifeline. But could he reach for it? He had learned to survive by his own means, but that hadn't brought him any closer to a real future. What was the point of surviving if you never really lived? Taking a deep breath, James slowly looked up at her, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to start over." His words were raw, vulnerable, the truth he had long hidden in the deepest part of himself. Melania smiled softly, her gaze unwavering. "We'll figure it out together." And in that moment, for the first time in years, James allowed himself to believe that there might be a way out of the darkness. James stood there, his feet rooted to the cold concrete, his mind struggling to catch up with the whirlwind of emotions racing through him. Melania's words, so simple, yet so profound, had pierced through the walls he had spent years building around his heart. "We'll figure it out together." The sincerity in her voice, the warmth in her eyes, it felt like a distant dream he was afraid to reach for. For a moment, he hesitated. The old habits, the ingrained skepticism, all fought for control. Could he trust this woman? Could he believe that someone like her, someone so far removed from his world, truly wanted to help him? The fear gnawed at him, whispering that this, like everything else, would end in disappointment. But then, he looked at her again. Her face wasn't filled with pity or condescension, as he had expected. No, Melania's expression was full of something far more powerful. Compassion. She wasn't just offering him a way out, she was offering him a chance to stand again. For the first time in years, James felt like he could breathe. Not just physically, but emotionally. The weight that had always pressed down on him seemed to lift, even if just for a moment. He swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. "But I've lost so much. I've been out here too long." His voice trembled with the vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to show for so long. It felt like the words were slipping out of him before he could stop them, and with each syllable, he felt himself unraveling in front of her. Melania took a small step closer, her eyes never leaving his. There was no rush, no impatience in her movements, only a quiet understanding. "You haven't lost everything, James. You still have a future." Her voice was soft but firm, carrying a strength that seemed to push back the shadows gathering in his mind. It was those words, the simple belief in a future, that resonated most deeply with him. James had convinced himself that his past defined him, that he was too far gone to ever find his way back. But here, in this moment, Melania was offering him the most precious thing of all, the belief that it wasn't too late to start over. The tears that welled up in his eyes were not of sorrow, but of something unfamiliar, hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way forward. His breath hitched as he fought to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to break free. Could he really trust her? Could he dare to dream again? Melania placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and in that touch, James found something he hadn't felt in years. A spark. The spark of possibility. The warmth of Melania's hand on his shoulder grounded him in a way nothing else had. In years. It was as if that single touch, so simple yet profound, shattered the last remnants of the walls he had built around his heart. James could feel the weight of her sincerity in her touch, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of change. He had lived so long in survival mode, doing everything he could just to get by, that he had forgotten what it felt like to truly live. He had accepted the darkness as his reality, convinced that the light at the end of the tunnel was just a mirage. But here, standing before him, was a woman who saw more in him than he had ever seen in himself. A future. The words were still echoing in his mind. You still have a future. Could he really begin again? Could he truly escape the cycle of hopelessness that had trapped him for so long? It seemed impossible. But then he thought of her smile. Soft, unwavering, full of the kind of hope he had long lost. She wasn't just offering him a handout. She was offering him a choice. James inhaled deeply, his chest tight with a mixture of fear and anticipation. I don't know how, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of those words was crushing, but they were the truth. How could he start over when every step forward felt like an insurmountable climb? How could he believe in the promise of a new life when his past had been filled with so much pain and loss? Melania's eyes never left him. She didn't judge him, didn't pull away. Instead, her gaze softened, and she spoke with quiet conviction. You don't have to know all the answers right now, James. Just take one step. That's all you need to do. One step toward something better. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. One step. That was all it took. He didn't need to have everything figured out. He didn't need to have all the answers. Just one step. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. James knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He had no illusions about that. But for the first time in years, he was willing to try. For the first time, he was willing to hope. With a shaky breath, he nodded. Okay. One step. And as he took that first step toward a new beginning, he felt the weight of the past begin to lift, just a little. It wasn't gone, not yet. But for the first time in a long while, James felt something he hadn't felt in years. The glimmer of possibility. James stood at the edge of a moment he never thought would come. His hands trembled as he took in the quiet encouragement in Melania's eyes. The air around them seemed to hold its breath, the weight of what was about to happen hanging in the space between them. The thought of stepping forward, of leaving behind the cold, familiar isolation he had known for so long, felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, the unknown stretching out before him in a vast, dark chasm. His mind screamed at him to pull back, to retreat to the safety of what he knew. After all, what if this was all just a dream? What if the hope Melania offered was fleeting, destined to fade just as quickly as it appeared? The fear of disappointment lurked in the corners of his mind, whispering its doubts, but for the first time, James didn't let it win. He couldn't. One step. That's all it would take. And somehow, with Melania's steady gaze rooted in his, he found the courage to silence the doubts. His breath hitched as he finally exhaled, as if releasing the fear that had clung to him for far too long. Taking that first step, James felt his legs wobble under the weight of everything he was leaving behind. His worn-out shoes scuffed against the pavement, and the cold air rushed past him. But there was something different about this step. It wasn't just a physical movement. It was a declaration. A declaration that he was willing to fight, to take control of his future, even if the path ahead was uncertain. Melania's words echoed in his mind. One step toward something better. And in that moment, it became clear that he wasn't just stepping toward a new life. He was stepping toward the possibility of redemption, of reclaiming the parts of himself he had long believed lost. His eyes met Melania's again, and this time, he didn't look away. She hadn't left him, hadn't judged him for his past or his uncertainty. She was still standing there, unwavering, offering him not just a chance, but belief. The street ahead was quiet, the world around him moving as it always had. But James was different now. For the first time in years, his heart felt lighter. He wasn't walking into the unknown with fear anymore. He was walking toward the possibility of becoming the person he was always meant to be. And as he took another step, he could feel the walls he had built for so long begin to crumble. Each footfall, though small, felt like the foundation of a new life. James took another step, his heart pounding in his chest as the world around him seemed to fall away. The noise of the city, the distant honking of cars, the chatter of passers-by, it all blurred into a muffled hum. His focus was entirely on the road ahead, on the path that felt so uncertain, yet so full of promise. He could feel the weight of his past, every mistake, every regret, trying to tug him back, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not now. Behind him, Melania was still there. She hadn't moved. She wasn't rushing him, wasn't pulling him forward. She was simply waiting. Her presence, calm and steady, wrapped around him like a safety net, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this. James glanced back at her, his mind racing. Why is she doing this? Why is she helping me? The questions lingered, but the answers seemed less important now. Her kindness wasn't something to analyze or dissect, it was something to be accepted. In this moment he realized that maybe, just maybe, he deserved it. He deserved to be seen, to be helped, to be given a chance to rebuild. And with that thought, a rush of gratitude flooded him, pushing the fear aside for just a moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. His words felt small, barely enough to express the depth of what he was feeling, but it was all he had. And somehow it felt like enough. Melania smiled, her eyes softening with understanding. She didn't need to say anything. Her smile said it all. She wasn't here for praise or recognition. She was here because she believed in him. She believed in the possibility of change, in the strength that lay dormant within him, just waiting to be awakened. James took another step, and then another. Each one felt less heavy than the last. The weight of his past still lingered, but with each movement forward, it seemed to become less defining. He wasn't just moving physically. He was moving emotionally, mentally. He was shedding layers of doubt and fear, piece by piece. As they continued down the street, the world around him seemed brighter. The sun seemed warmer, the air fresher, and for the first time in a long time, James felt the stirrings of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. And that was all he needed. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he was willing to face it. He was willing to trust again, to hope. And that, he realized, was the most powerful step of all. The weight on James's chest had lessened with every step, but the path ahead still felt vast and uncharted. Each footfall was an echo of a life he had left behind, and yet, with every step, the uncertainty felt a little more bearable. The world around him felt more vivid now, the colors brighter, the air fresher. It was as if, with each step, he was waking up from a long, dark slumber. But the journey wasn't just physical. It was deeper than that. It was a journey of the heart, one that could only begin when he allowed himself to trust again. He glanced at Melania once more, who walked beside him now, her presence like a gentle anchor, grounding him when his thoughts threatened to scatter. She hadn't said a word since he'd thanked her. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than any words could. It was the quiet reassurance that he was not alone in this. Not anymore. A mix of emotions swirled inside him. Fear, hope, doubt, gratitude. All these feelings intertwined, creating a whirlwind that was hard to make sense of. James had spent so long in the shadows, hiding from the world and from himself, that the thought of truly stepping into the light felt both thrilling and terrifying. The future was still uncertain. He didn't know where this path would lead, what obstacles he would face, or if he would fall back into old habits. But for the first time, he didn't feel paralyzed by the unknown. Melania's soft voice broke through his thoughts. "It's okay to be scared," she said, her words simple but powerful. "You don't have to have it all figured out. Just keep moving forward. One day at a time." Her words were like a balm to his troubled mind, easing the tension in his shoulders. The truth was, James had never allowed himself the space to feel fear in a healthy way. Fear had always been something to hide from, something to suppress. But now, he was learning that it didn't have to control him. It could be a companion, one he acknowledged but didn't let dominate his every decision. As they continued walking, James realized that the hardest part was over. He had taken the first step, the one that had felt impossible only hours ago. And now, with each stride, he was beginning to believe that change wasn't just possible. It was happening. Slowly, steadily, he was carving out a new path for himself, one that was filled with hope, not fear. And in that moment, he understood what Melania had been trying to teach him all along. It wasn't about finding the answers immediately. It was about trusting the journey, one step at a time. And for the first time, James felt ready to embrace it.